Greetings, and welcome to Composting Causations. We're here with the tip of the hat to have a chat. Let me check my sounds real quick. I had to check my sounds real quick so we can be right quack. Yes, welcome. This particular broadcast is going to be a brief watch along of some work that I did back in the day. And yeah, let's have a look see. Wishfully everybody's doing well on this beautiful sunny day. I don't even have to use my lights. Let me see what that looks like. Does that help? Let me see. How does that look? Boom, boom, boom. Natural sunlight is the way. So let's celebrate the day. And I'm going to share my screen now. What we're going to do, and again, as you come in, please make sure you like, subscribe, share, click the notification bell. And yeah. What we're going to do is we're going to have a watch along of a very prominent video of a very prominent site and a very prominent man and his work. And I am a part of that work and a part of that legacy that has been put in place. And it continues to this day. That's right, with no delay. Okay. So with that being said, let's get out of our head and let's get into the video. So I'm going to share my screen now. I like to break it down, break it, forsake it. So if we read, it says, Urban Community Composting, How to Build a Windrow, Added Value. Now, apparently this is Added Value's YouTube channel, but Added Value, from what I know in Redhoook, was the organization and institution that eventually took over the composting site in Redhoook. I mean, well, not the composting site, the farm side of that block, that beautiful rectangle that is in Redhoook. Otsego, Sigourney, Columbia Street area near Bay Street. And right next to IKEA, across the street from IKEA, actually. And yeah, the playgrounds and near the bus station, the projects and all of that. So located right there in the smack dab of it all is this beautiful rectangle. And about 2/3 of it is the farm side of things. And that's Added Value, once known as something else. And the composting side was different organizations that had their hand in it. And I think Added Value now has their hand in that as well. So that's what we're going to focus in on. But that's Added Value. This might be their channel. But it talks about David Buckel An added value volunteer at the Redhoook Community Farm explains how to build a windrow. This method is used to make rich compost for the local community. For more resources on composting, check out this link. Google, shot and edited by Steven Zettler. So we got to give credit where credit is due. At that point, the person who you're going to see was a volunteer, but he went on to do much more than being a volunteer. He was formerly a civil rights lawyer and chose to do a self-immolation protest in reference to fossil fuels. And however, during his life as a composter, this was his project as a composter. I think when he was at the Brooklyn Botanic Gardens, in the composting program that they had there, and this was his project that came out of that. So at that time that you're viewing this video, or when it was released, it says June 24th, 2014. He was still considered potentially a volunteer of the Redhoook Community Farm that was run by Added Value. And well, it was once Added Value, now it's RHI, Redhoook Initiative. So yeah, he would go on to, I think, get compensated for that and hire an employee or two, and thus began the journey even further. This man right here, who I'm circling on the screen, has a very, very powerful hand in that. And David Buckel was his mentor, and he would go on. This man right here, Domingo Morales, would go on to be my mentor. So it was Domingo and I, and Xander as well, Xander Shaw, who would carry on that tradition and do some great work on the composting site. We'll watch that video, and maybe next Saturday we'll watch this video right here. Pretty awesome, pretty cool. In the meantime, let's get into it. Let's see. Let's just click on this link and see what becomes of it. Oh, well, there you go with that. Let's close that out. Nothing became of it. It just says site not found. So let's go back to this and let's get into it and see where this goes. So right away, it says Urban Community Composting, How to Build a Windrow, a public service educational video. And I'm actually going to put my headphones on because I want to hear this in real time so that I can be able to add some commentary in real time. So let's do this. We're going to be right black. That's right, because it's Black History Month and Black Future Month. So I'm going to turn up the music and I'll be right forward. And we are here, but I am not queer. Just sharing. You're learning a little bit more about who I am. That's all. I have that right and freedom to do so, right? David on the other end might be a different story, but we all make the world go round. So we celebrate all kinds of people who are doing this great work on planet Earth. And let's get into it. All right, here we go. Fair use, fair use. Did Added Value make this video though? I mean, I'm not seeing any, I mean, it must have been them. So here we go. Let's get into it.
Hi, I'm David Buckel. I'm one of the volunteers here at the Redhoook Community Farm in Brooklyn, New York. Today, we're going to talk about how to build a windrow entirely by hand. Here at the farm, they call it Big Salad Day because last night, several tons of food scraps were delivered from local farmers.
So what David is doing is he's starting from the top in terms of when you bring your local food scraps to a composting site, this is what happens. To a community composting site, this is what happens. So this is how it all works and how you take food scraps from the community members locally and return it back as finished incredible compost, a kind of soil amendment to nourish your houseplants, nourish trees in your neighborhood, add sustenance and sustainability and nutrients to your garden, home garden, backyard, front yard. All of that. So he's giving you the explanation from the top. And as you can see behind him are the solar panels, because the site is the country's largest fully renewable composting site. No fossil fuels were used to process any of the food scraps or handle the compost itself. And so it was a wind turbine and the solar panels that you see behind them. And that's the world famous Redhoook site and Redhoook farm, Redhoook composting site and Redhoook farm. And that's a special building that's behind him too. But that's a conversation for another day. Let's move onward.
Farmers markets, and it all gets tossed together today. Eventually it will turn into rich compost. This is the largest compost program in New York City that is run entirely on sustainable resources, either solar power or human power. It's also an example of a community compost site. City residents generate a lot of material that can be used for valuable compost, and some of that should stay in the community for the benefit of the community. For example, compost can be...
So you saw the woman turning the tumbler, which is a kind of mechanism that is used to process your food scraps when you mix the appropriate level of carbon-based items with nitrogen-based items. In the right amount, you got your greens and your browns. Our ratio was 3-to-1, 3 parts carbon, 1 part nitrogen. So that's 1 part food scraps and 3 parts. It could be wood chips, wood shavings, maybe a little bit of straw or hay, so on and so forth. So you saw the tumbling process and these providing further detail. So let's continue onward and
City residents generate a lot of material that can be used for valuable compost, and some of that should stay in the community for the benefit of the community. For example, compost can be used to benefit food gardens and street trees.
Yep.
The more people we get involved with making the compost, the more we engage and interest community members in making things better for their community and the environment. One of the goals is to figure out ways to make it easier for volunteers to work at a community compost site like this. Composting is rewarding in so many ways, but it's not easy. It's hard work. The goal is to figure out ways. For example, compost can be used to benefit food gardens and street trees. The more people we get involved with making the compost, the more we engage and interest community members in making things better.
Now that shot right there behind where he's at right now, across the street, is one of Amazon's major, huge buildings that's there. So it's beautiful to see the world before the time where, so many major corporations are just swooping in and just taking up land and so on and so forth. So this video itself goes back about 8.5, 9 years. So yeah, that's the time frame that we're dealing with. Some point, probably springtime 2014, or was released summertime 2014. So yeah.
For their community and the environment. One of the goals is to figure out ways to make it easier for volunteers to work at a community compost site like this. Composting is rewarding in so many ways, but it's not easy. It's hard work. There are lots of methods to make things easier for volunteers.
Hot babe alert. Beautiful people alert. The site, I stressed this in the previous broadcast, volunteering is a sacred act and sacred action. And for this particular site, and as it pertains to composting, local community composting sites, a lot of the sites are able to stay open, especially if they're hand tool powered. They're able to stay open and function and continue by a great majority of the utilization, and the teamwork of volunteers. If it wasn't for volunteers, a staff member or two would not be able to do the work of turning, managing, giving away, receiving like hundreds of thousands of pounds of material, food scraps, and finished compost. And so having, tens of volunteers come every single weekend and putting them to use and having them learn something new and be engaged is really what keeps the site open and functioning and able to do what it does. And is really doing your part, on planet Earth and in your part of the world to keep this cycle of sustainability and more of a green, eco-aware and eco-friendly living going. So cheers to all the volunteers. And you're seeing this is obviously a volunteer day or volunteer time frame within Monday through Friday that has been allotted to do the work. So
it's hard work.
It's very hard work, challenging.
There are lots of methods to make things easier for volunteers. There are the usual things like sending an email in advance with helpful info and providing an orientation once the volunteers arrive at the site. But it's also important to adapt to the experience with the volunteers. Here's 3 beginning tips for you. 1, try to have some jobs ready for veteran volunteers who may not want to go through the orientation again. 2, look for some leadership opportunities for those veteran volunteers because they might find that rewarding, but be prepared. They may just want to be worker bees, and that's okay too. 3, try to remember to let the team know that there's a final step in the process of building a windrow called the seal. And if you don't let them know now, they might think once they've got all the food scraps done, they're all done, and they'll feel a little disappointed. So get their expectations oriented.
Get their expectations oriented. This is very, very key to the best of your ability. It's this is leadership. This is knowing how to, like he touched on in the previous segment, knowing people's abilities, knowing and being able to read them on the fly, as they're working throughout the process. It's a major component and a major nuance in being a leader in general and leading people. And I've done this work specifically, so I know how you have to gauge people as they come in and not overly judge them, but as the work gets going, or even before you even start, when people select the shovels that they choose or the size of the pitchfork or rake and how they're holding it, you can already at that point surmise their knowledge level, their comfortability level, looking at their facial expressions, their body language, and then as they move throughout that process, how much of that shifts and changes in either direction. You can kind of like, as the process is going along, shift accordingly and have them shift accordingly. If they're doing very, very well and they want to do more and step it up, okay, maybe you can put them in the lead, or you can change, shift them over to a different task because they're getting super excited. So they want to get as much, of experience as they possibly can doing different tasks. Or someone's just like, I'm complete. I got a good groove. Let me keep going. Let me keep flowing. Someone's just like, this is not my thing. So you might want to move them to a different task that might be a bit easier and lighter and, something different for them to explore and feel comfortable with. And so these nuances of leadership, I just find very stimulating and intriguing about human behavior and just knowing how to essentially find people's comfort zone for efficiency, for best efficiency. When you're trying to complete a task or feat and you're leading people, you gotta find where they're most comfortable, because where they're most comfortable, you can meet them there and then allow that to improve. And so their comfort zone is going to be where they're going to be most efficient. But if you can stretch that and motivate them and like stimulate them mentally and kind of like, give them more confidence by positive reaffirmations and just saying certain things and, music, a conversation, it can go a long way towards like having them feel like they can do the work and that they're getting better. So part of me, I was getting excited about it. That's all.
Before the volunteers show up, assemble the ingredients. If you don't, then some volunteers will stand around waiting for things.
This woman is distracting me. She's bow-legged and beautiful. Not to mention she's a redhead. That's a conversation for another day that I'm trying not to have today. But I'm saying that to say that this, I look at it as this is a meal. And in order to make the meal of the highest quality, you have to be the chef. And the chef has to know the kind of ingredients that has to go into that meal. Because what are you trying to make? And who's going to be eating it? Okay. Now, what needs to go in that meal, and in what proportions, or what portions does it need to go in that meal? And so you have to follow a certain recipe so that anybody else who gets or wants to make the same meal, they can just follow the same recipe and have the ingredients in the right proportions. And ideally, what's going to come out is a finished product that is similar to what similar or the same, or your ideal result of what it is you were trying to make. So it's going to be delicious and so on and so forth. So he's getting into what the appropriate ingredients are for you to build a windrow, because that's the essence of this video, right? How to build a windrow. So that's what David is getting into. And I just find it fascinating that it applies to so many things in life. You need the right ingredients. Not only that, then you need the right tools. Do you have the measuring cup? Do you have the strainer? So in this case, do you have the right pitchfork? Do you have the right shovel? Are you using the appropriate technique?
Before the volunteers show up, assemble the ingredients. If you don't, then some volunteers will stand around waiting for things. If you want a successful volunteer program, you have to watch the volunteers closely to see what's going on. So for example, if you see someone who is standing around or looking confused, then that's the sort of thing that goes on your checklist to try to prevent the next time around.
Yep.
In the meantime, apologize so they know it's not about them, it's about you. Having the footprint already in place for the windrow.
Yeah, because you're the leader. So if they've gotten to the point of being frustrated or starting to tap out, some blame and some responsibility goes on them as a human, but overall it falls on you because they're having a new experience or an experience that they're less familiar with than you are. So it's up to you to do what you possibly can to ensure that they're having the most optimal experience and successful experience. And you want to make sure that the task is complete in a timely manner. And if you have disgruntled, volunteers or workers, then you're working backwards. You're doing extra work and everybody else has to do extra work. You got to be aware of the morale that's being built up or taken away based upon who's feeling how they feel. So do your best to, like he said, pay attention to, and like I mentioned earlier, being able to read the room or read the site and move people accordingly and communicate. It's very, very key.
Is also helpful for orienting the volunteers to their workspace, either wood chips or unsifted compost about 4 inches high. As you know, the ingredients for building a windrow fall into 2 basic categories. Number 1, carbon-based materials like leaves, wood chips, wood shavings, and hay. We call them browns. Number 2, nitrogen-based material like food scraps. We call them greens. The recipe varies depending on what type of compost you want, and at this site, the proportion of greens to browns is roughly 50-50. For more on the science behind the ingredients,
50-50, but eventually they got shifted because that's a 1-to-1 ratio. Eventually that got turned to 2-to-1, and then it got turned to 3-to-1. Now that can also be shifted depending upon the season that you're in. When it's hotter outside, you might want to, versus in contrast to when it's colder outside. If it's a rainy week or strong happening, do you use more or less? If the food scraps are a bit fresher versus if they're older. So it's knowing all these nuances that we don't have, we're not going to get into in fine detail in this video, but it's knowing all these different nuances as you're live in front of what it is you're working on. So just some additional information.
Check out the link we give you at the end of the video. At this site, some of the greens arrive from local farmers markets in these black bins. So here's an example
orders.
of how to avoid volunteers standing around and waiting. Pick a team that constantly brings over the bins, although make sure you offer to have them trade places at some point.
GCF in the house, Green City Force, you know what it is.
So they have a chance to do something different. In addition, choose a set number of bins to bring over at each round to line up for tipping into the windrow, which will allow the volunteers to get into a consistent routine.
The good tipping.
Once in a while, you might do things for the sake of the volunteers that aren't necessarily the best practice, as long as you can later restore the best practice. For example, the best practice is to blend the browns and the greens on the side of the windrow and then toss them onto the mound. That way you preserve the air pockets needed for making good compost. But for a big windrow like this, you may have to tip the bins directly onto the mound at the beginning of the process, even though that crushes some of the air pockets. Otherwise, the work session may be too long and volunteers will start to get discouraged or leave before you are done.
Super, super key. Another example of being able to shift accordingly. And sometimes, you know, it's a trade-off, being able to read the room, knowing how many people you have, their capabilities and abilities, as David started speaking about as he started the video, and knowing what the time frame is, you know, and how many food scraps you got and how many you can process for the, you know, so on and so forth. Oh, that redhead is hot. Even though that crushes some of the air pockets. Otherwise,
back
and have a look.
That way you preserve the air pockets needed for making good compost. But for a big windrow like this, you may have to tip the bins directly onto the mound at the beginning of the process, even though that crushes some of the air pockets. Otherwise, the work session may be too long and volunteers will start to get discouraged or leave before you are done. So how do you fix things here to make sure you get back to the best practice? Well, at this site, they know that in a couple days they can have another team of volunteers come in and turn the windrow and put those air pockets back in place.
Now, the thing about it is,
on the other hand, if an extra large
thing about it is this, right? So when you saw them dumping or tipping the food scraps on top of the browns, the nitrogen-based material on top of the carbon-based material, and David's talking about, you know, unfortunately, you might be, you know, taking away or covering up or crushing some air pockets. And then, you know, fortunately enough, you know that there's going to be another volunteer day, either the next day or in a few days, so they can open it up, so that window's not going to be sitting too long without being adjusted. But the point that he touched on in reference to working on the side versus doing it on top. Now, at this point, what they're probably going to do is they're going to do a lot of chopping of the food scraps on top of the pile as it sits right there on top of the bedding. They're going to have to chop the material into smaller bits, because think of it like the people who are eating the meal, or the entities that are eating the meal, are the micro and the macroorganisms. And so that's who you're making this dish, this meal for. And it works the same way as it does humans. In order for you to properly eat and digest your food, you have to what? You have to, use a big word, masticate. You have to chew and break down the pieces of meat into smaller pieces and liquefy it with your saliva, so that's much more easily able to travel down your throat, esophagus, into your small intestine, and makes it easily digestible versus it being in solid form and in large chunks. The same thing applies to this entity that would be the windrow and the macroorganisms and the microorganisms. The larger that the piece are, the longer it takes to decompose those pieces of vegetables and, you know, fruits and bread. But the smaller pieces they are, the smaller the pieces, the easier and quicker that the decomposition process can happen and take place. And so you have to, with the chopper, break it down. So because, as he said, in the essence of time and the number of volunteers and the amount of food scraps that need to be processed, you're going to have to amend your technique or amend what you usually would do with the volunteers. So it's a sacrifice. And so they're probably going to chop on top of the pile the items to be in smaller pieces instead of doing it on the side where they would do it and then toss it up onto the pile. So a nuance.
But for a big windrow like this, you may have to tip the bins directly onto the mound at the beginning of the process, even though that crushes some of the air pockets. Otherwise, the work session may be too long and volunteers will start to get discouraged or leave before you are done. So how do you fix things here to make sure you get back to the best practice? Well, at this site, they know that in a couple days, they can have another team of volunteers come in
Awesome.
and turn the windrow and put those air pockets back in place.
Awesome.
On the other hand, if an extra large group of volunteers shows up for a big salad day like this one, then the leader might decide to blend all materials to the side for the entire build of the windrow.
Again, salad day, because think of it the same way as if you're making a salad. You know, you can individually cut the ingredients up and you add them together and then you mix them. You know, same technique here. As you see, dump it out on the side. You chop it up in smaller pieces, the same way that you might do some raisins, some cranberries, some walnuts, some almonds, whatever kind of nuts that you're putting in your salad, and even the lettuce or the kale, the spinach, whatever kind of salad you're making, you're chopping it up on the side before you put it in the bowl. And then when you put it in the bowl, you're adding this, you're adding that, you're adding this, you're adding that, and then you're mixing it up all together. And then the finished product that's the finished salad. Same thing here. You got different ingredients being chopped up, addressed on the side, and then they're being added bit by bit. And then at the end, you're just mixing it all up.
Mound. That serves two purposes. First, it's a better way to process. And second,
and this is the ideal way that he was talking about. Sometimes you have to amend and move away from that. But this is, ideally how it would go on the side of the main pile.
This one, then the leader might decide to blend all materials to the side for the entire build of the windrow mound. That serves two purposes. First, it's a better way to process. And second, the extra work turns into a positive rather than a negative because there are more people to keep busy. Being flexible up to the last minute is part of the art of composting by hand and putting a priority on people. Generally, every site is different.
Prioritize the people
In their approaches because volunteers at each site are different in how long they like to work and how often they can show up. So it's important not to assume one approach fits all, but instead to be thoughtful about what seems to work best for volunteers at a particular site. On some things, though, we can't cut corners because it is too hard to fix. So it's important for every whole vegetable or fruit to have one approach fits all, but instead to be thoughtful about how long they like to work and how often they can show up. Generally, every site is different in their approaches because volunteers at each site are different in how long they like to work and how often they can show up. So it's important not to assume one approach fits all, but instead to be thoughtful about what seems to work best for volunteers at a particular site. On some things, though, we can't cut corners because it is too hard to fix. So it's important for every whole vegetable or fruit to have at least one slice so the compost process can start. And it's important to pull out any inorganics like bands or plastic bags. Here, the leader has a small team split off from the main group to get wood chips needed for the recipe.
So it's important, like that piece of cabbage would need to be chopped into quarters at the bare minimum. He said one chop, cool, that helps to open it up. But by the time I was there, it was like, okay, 4 quarters. If you got time to do 8s, that's even better. That's even better. Now, taking off stickers and, plastic ties are super, super important and key because even though some of them are advertised to be biodegradable, a lot of them and most of them aren't. So it doesn't break down appropriately. And because it's an inorganic piece of material, so it needs to be extracted. because it will slow down the process, contaminate the pile, or you wind up picking it out at the end as you're at the sifting table. So just more work at the end. So it's best to do it before, then, and even while you're at home when you're bringing your food scraps to that food scrap drop off site. Peel off the stickers off of your fruits. Take off the ties. That's part of the pre-composting process. It just makes it easier on everybody. So very, very key. Now here we are dealing with the wood chips, the bulk browns, high levels of carbon, much needed to aerate the pile and add carbon to it.
The leader has a small team split off from the main group to get wood chips needed for the recipe. They use the food scrap bins to carry the wood chips because the wood chips help clean out those bins. Because the bins are being tipped directly onto the windrow.
The wood chips help clean out those bins. Now, that's a very, very key point. That's called dry cleaning it. Sometimes when you don't have water available or when you're in a rush, you don't necessarily have to use water it's best to, but you don't necessarily have to wash out the bins at the end of the composting session. You can also dry wash it by using wood chips or wood shavings to kind of get out the nitrogen-based particles from it, and what's essentially left is just browns, and no animal is going to come to try to eat on wood chips, or wood shavings per se. So it's a way to dry wash it and kind of sanitize it in a different way if you're in a pinch or if you have to have a backup plan. So he mentioned that as something extra of the wood chips being available to also do that as well.
Team split off from the main group to get wood chips needed for the recipe. They use the food scrap bins to carry the wood chips because the wood chips help clean out those bins. Because the bins are being tipped directly onto the windrow for now, the browns and the greens have to go onto the mound in alternating layers. Find ways to let everyone know that it's time.
The lasagna effect, because there's so much you don't want to have a bed of browns and then a super thick layer of greens and then a small layer of browns on top. No, you want to do an equal amount of browns, or maybe a heavier amount of browns, and then a layer of greens, and then an equal layer, in thickness and breadth of browns, and then a layer of greens, and then a layer of browns, and so on and so forth. Then at some point you got to cap it, and then add the seal as he touched on earlier. Let's continue. Fair use.
Time for a new layer, so they're ready to move forward in a routine. So for example, you might call out, "Ready for greens." After adding a layer of browns and greens, the last two layers are blended while on the
volunteer
mound.
leaving, sucker. No, thank you for your contribution, man. Ready for greens.
After adding a layer of browns and greens, the last two layers are blended while on the mound. This process of adding layers and blending gets repeated over and over again. Once the layers have all been added, the windrow will have to be sealed up to keep warm.
My fave. Now that mixing technique was interesting. When I was there, we kind of once we take the pitchforks and kind of sift through and make sure that, the majority of the food scraps have been broken down into smaller particles. Then we go in with the shovels, and from the base of the pile, go in as far as we possibly can, starting from the end, and then turn over the shovel. And as you do that, that's aerating the pile and also mixing all the materials, the greens and the browns together. And you kind of pull it back, and then you do that 2 times, maybe 3 times in that same exact area, and then you move on further down the pile. So
warmth in and rodents out.
Look at that.
Here they planned ahead for the right moment
pyramid.
to split off.
Look at that triangle being formed.
Once the layers have all been added, the windrow will have to be sealed up to keep warmth in and rodents out. Here they planned ahead for the right moment to split off a couple team members who start pulling that seal material into wheelbarrows. And that way, when the time comes, volunteers aren't standing around waiting for that material.
Yep. So that pile has been mixed. The salad is complete, but you can't leave it like that, because if you leave it like that, that's welcoming and inviting to all kinds of creatures, quote unquote, rodents, animals in the neighborhood, raccoons, rats, cats, anything that you can think of, roaches. And so you can't leave it like that. You have to seal or put a coat on top of it. And not only does that block the smell of the food scraps, but it blocks the sight of the food scraps. But also, just like if you put a coat on, regardless of the season, what's going to happen to you? Your body's going to warm up. And so that allows for the pile to warm up, for the temperatures begin to rise, and then you have the convection or heat begins to happen, and the microorganisms and the macroorganisms begin to have a dance and procreate and poop and move around and eat and decompose the compost. So you can see that these volunteers were already tasked with this specific task of getting the sill ready, and the sill is older food scraps and composting material that's been on site for at least, I want to say, a month. That's to be safe and sorry. So it's been turned and aerated at least 2-3 times already. So that's what's being done. So a month and a half at least. So that's there. Or more. You could even use cured compost that is fit. Well, you don't want to be using cured compost just yet. But anyway, nuances. Got to get back to it.
As you watch your volunteers work, you keep making adjustments to suit them as best you can.
Well, we're watching them, all right. There's that redhead with that orange hat, I tell you.
You may start by having the volunteers tip the bins directly into the mound, but at some point the mound is so high that some volunteers are struggling to get the bins up high enough. So again, you have to be flexible to foster a successful volunteer program. And that means you change the process so volunteers are blending from the side. Keep track of when the ingredients are running low, because at some point you will start having the volunteers use the remaining material to create a narrow ridge at the top of the windrow. That ridge helps promote the composting process because it creates a chimney effect for airflow. Once all the ingredients are in the windrow mound, it is time to tuck everything in with brooms and the flat side of rakes.
Now the chimney effect, in the epicenter, this windrow, as you can see, is in a pyramid shape, a triangle shape. Pyramid, pyro, mid, fire in the middle. It's ancient, it's sacred, conversation for a different day. However, the science remains and stands. The chimney effect over the next 48 to 72 hours, the epicenter of that windrow, the center is going to heat up, and that's going to be the hottest spot and location of the windrow. And you got the convectional heat moving around, and then as the hot air rises, the heat will eventually begin to rise up, and it's going to come off the ridge, the peak, the apex of that pile off the triangle. So you'll walk in several days and you'll see steam coming off of the ridge or the top. So that's why the triangle shape and the building of the windrow is so key, because it's actually a technology, an ancient technology, geography and geometry. This shape that is being used as a triangle and a pyramid to complete a specific task of decomposition, but also being able to create and maintain and release appropriate heat. And so that's what a windrow is. Windrow put together, because it's about how the air and oxygen flow goes past the windrow, how it moves through it, just how it's transferred and how it communicates with the windrow itself. It's evenly distributed. When it rains, or if you're putting some water on the pile, the windrow, the mound by way of a water hose, that water can be evenly distributed because it goes down evenly and runs along the sides, and some goes down the middle, and so we're dealing with the heat and how that's evenly distributed throughout the pile. You're dealing with the hydration or the water and how that is evenly distributed throughout the pile. You're dealing with oxygen flow, and obviously this is earthen material. So you're literally dealing with all four elements. It's very, very beautiful and very, very sacred work, which is why I'm so fascinated and passionate about it, as you can see and bear witness to. So, yeah, windrow, mound, pile, pyramid. We are back rebuilding. We're here, reborn. Science. So you're tucking it in. So you can't just leave things all over the place and just let it sit and then put the seal on, because then you'll be stepping on the material that you were just working with. And there's food particles, food scraps, small, some a bit larger, that will get caught onto the bottom of your feet, your boots, your shoes, your sneakers, your clothing, and then you'll be transporting it all over the site, which is not smart, because that is an invite for those same entities, those animals, those quote unquote rodents or pests, as some may call them, to come onto the sites. And so before, you put the seal on and the cap on, you want to push in all of the material, the greens and the browns, the carbon and the nitrogen based material that's been just mixed. And you also want to help solidify the base of that pyramid, of that mound, of that windrow, because you're making a recipe. You're making a recipe. You are making a recipe. You're making a recipe. So your meal has to have some sort of some parameters around it as well. It's in a pot. It's in a bowl. And so here, because it's outdoors and it just is not best, as I just mentioned, for it to be all over the site, spread out, you got to put it in a certain format and frame for it to be most efficient. I'm talking a lot. Let's move onward, tucking it in with the brooms. Got to make sure you choose the right broom, and the broom technique is very, very key. So I'm not going to critique the volunteers and how they're doing it. They're doing it. So let's move forward. But it is very, very key for safety first purposes. Safety first always.
Take a moment to admire the windrow the volunteers have created.
Beautiful.
Remind them of the next steps. Let them know that a break is on the way.
Yes.
And emphasize the importance of sweeping the surface clean.
Mm-hmm.
More than any other step in the process, this is the one that helps control rodents like rats. So the volunteers need the information to know why this step cannot be a sloppy one.
Mm-hmm.
Bits of food roll far and wide or drop from the shovels and the pitchforks that are left off to the side. So volunteers may have to start sweeping up to 20 feet out from the windrow.
Yep.
A zigzag motion is more effective because the broom comes at food bits from two different directions. After the sweep up is all done, is a good time for a break because it's a moment of accomplishment and the windrow is a pretty thing to look at. This is a time when you can mention how much material the volunteers have diverted from landfill and answer questions the volunteers may have. The last step is the seal, to keep warmth in and rats or birds out. Here the choice is to use more developed compost.
You got to use a very specific technique though when you put the seal on. You don't just toss up. You don't just dump it out and toss up. You got to build up the base and then have that be a certain length away, 12 to 15 inches ideally. Well, not the seal itself has to go on the pile as you dump it out of the wheelbarrows. But you don't want that seal to just be laying flat up against the initial mound. You want to create a certain to call cupcake technique, or you want to have about 12 to 15 inches of distance as you're building it up, and then at the end you'll fill that in.
For the seal. To ensure a uniform depth for the seal, the work starts at the bottom and proceeds up, similar to bricklaying or building an igloo.
Yep.
This windrow was built entirely by hand. The volunteers got great exercise while helping to build community and improve the environment. So that's how we do a big salad here at the Redhoook Community Farm. The focus is on people and trying to make adjustments as often as we can so it's easier for the volunteers to do the work and enjoy it, while at the same time making really good compost for the community. What we're going to do now is put up on the screen a web link for you as a launch pad to other resources.
Amazing. I just realized something. I had two broadcasts scheduled today, and I'm doing the wrong video. On yeah, I was supposed to do this video secondly, and the other video first. So the title doesn't match. So this broadcast, if you're watching it live, if you're watching the playback, then everything's going to be good. But this title should actually be building a windrow at Redhoook, David Buckel. So I had to change the title around. I thought that I said to myself, "Don't do that," and I did it. But it's all good. So, but that's what's going on here. So let's hear David close things out once again. Show him the appropriate honor that he deserves.
Redhoook Community Farm. The focus is on people and trying to make adjustments as often as we can so it's easier for the volunteers to do the work and enjoy it, while at the same time making really good compost for the community. What we're going to do now is put up on the screen a web link for you as a launch pad to other resources.
Awesome. What is that that's growing? You guys? That was beautiful. That was beautiful. Pardon me. Let's do this. Awesome. That was beautiful. Let me check my sounds real quick. That was beautiful. So there you have it. That was how to build a windrow, starting from scratch, employing a methodology that David Buckel popularized. So this video is entitled Redhoook Composting Site, David Buckel. So we want to give credit to the work that was initiated, started on that composting site, and the man who led that charge throughout the years, and that would be Mr. David Buckel. And so give thanks to the work and give thanks to the volunteers. Yes, round of applause. And to David himself and the legacy that he left and put in place and set up for who would come after him. That being Domingo Morales, Akhmos Arihotep, AkhmostistTheCompostist, and Xander Shaw. On and on and on and on. And the young people who are to follow. Younger people who are to follow. So that is that. Wishfully you enjoyed this particular broadcast. And you know, as we I didn't even have the appropriate background music going on. But let's see. Should we choose that as the outro music? Let's choose that as the outro music. This right here should have been the background music. Let's rock out to that just for a little bit. Nice. Provided by StreamYard. You already began the chatter. So again, as you come in, please make sure you like, subscribe, share, click the notification bell. If you'd like to contribute in a different way, on the screen is how you may do such. And yeah, thank you all once again. You are appreciated. And I am elated. So until next time, you all be good, be well, and drink fresh water from your well. This has been Compost and Causations. I'm AkhmostistTheCompostist. Until next time, peace and love.